From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Free Expression with Jerry Baker.
Hello and welcome to Free Expression from the Wall Street Journal. I'm Jerry Baker, editor-at-large of the Journal. If you're not already a subscriber to the Free Expression podcast, please do sign up wherever you do your listening. This week, are we losing the new Cold War? It's become axiomatic recently, and a source of rare bipartisan agreement, that the United States is in a long strategic struggle for global leadership with the People's Republic of China. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, more than 30 years ago, America's supremacy is seriously challenged by a powerful ideological rival. The outcome of this struggle is as essential to our way of life as was the outcome of the first Cold War. If China were to come to dominate the planet in the way the US has done for most of the last century, our freedoms would be increasingly constrained, and the risks of instability and even violent conflict would surely rise. In many ways, China's an even bigger threat than was the USSR back then, a much more populous country with a more dynamic economy and a rapidly strengthening military capability. And yet, despite acknowledging the challenge we face, our policymakers don't really seem that serious about dealing with it. While the Trump administration and then the Biden administration have taken measures to check the growth of China's strategic reach and its ability to compete with the US in technological advances, the PRC just keeps steadily growing in stature and power. Meanwhile, our own defense capabilities are atrophying, and our ability to prevent China from achieving strategic parity, at least, seems quite weak. So what do we need to do? Well, I'm pleased to be joined this week by someone who's not only thought and written a lot about this topic, but has also worked on practical solutions. Mike Gallagher stepped down as a member of Congress earlier this year. In his 3+ terms representing Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District in the House of Representatives, Gallagher served on several committees, including Armed Services, and chaired a new select committee dealing specifically with the challenge from Communist China. Before being elected to Congress, he was a Marine Corps intelligence officer, and he served 2 terms in Iraq. Both inside and outside Congress, Gallagher's been warning of the threat from China and our failure to address it properly. Last month, he and Matt Pottinger, who served on Donald Trump's National Security Council, published an article in Foreign Affairs in which they warned that simply managing the competition with China, as the Biden administration seems to be doing, is not enough. Instead, we must win it. And I'm glad to say Mike Gallagher joins me now. Mike Gallagher, thanks for joining Free Expression.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
You stepped down from Congress just earlier this year in a tumultuous political time, I think it's fair to say. And I want to talk to you a bit about the Republican Party, about our national politics, and obviously an election year, talk about all that. But I want to get to the heart of the matter first with you and this critical topic that you've spent so much time writing and thinking and indeed acting as a policymaker about, which is China. You wrote recently in a piece you co-authored with Matt Pottinger, who served on Donald Trump's Security Council, that while there was bipartisan agreement about the threat, the challenge from China, and while some important measures had been taken to deal with it, our approach, particularly the approach of the Biden administration at the moment, seems to be one of essentially managing China's rise or managing the competition with China rather than winning it. Explain what you meant by that.
Our argument in sum is that this idea of managed competition is not a goal, it's a process. To the extent there is a goal, it seems to be to take the temperature down to avoid escalation, particularly leading in to the election. The problem with that, well, there are many problems with that as we see it, is that that approach breeds complacency in the national security bureaucracy that really should be preparing to wage Cold War so as to avoid a hot war. It sends the wrong signal to a Marxist-Leninist regime. There's a paradox when dealing with Marxist-Leninist regimes that the more you try to accommodate them, the more aggressive they become. And without a sort of coherent goal to guide American grand strategy, as we had in the old Cold War, we risk being thrown about and pushed off course by turbulent geopolitical events. And right now, it seems that global events that are driven by Xi Jinping and his axis of chaos, which includes Russia, Iran and its terrorist proxies, North Korea and Venezuela, are simply overwhelming Biden's China policy. Better for us to have a more confrontational approach that aims towards victory in a Cold War. And Matt Pottinger and I believe that gives us the best chance of preventing a hot war in the near, mid, and long term.
What do you think China is aiming to do? And we can talk about some of the specifics, obviously, with regard to Taiwan or the South China Sea. But how do you think China sees a resurgent China, because after all, China used to be hundreds of years ago, very powerful. How do you think China sees its role? Because you do hear some people who say, China just wants, isn't looking for world domination, isn't not looking to push its ideology around the world, even in the way that the Soviet Union did. What do you think China's broad strategic goals are?
Well, one of the criticisms of our article has been that by framing it in existential terms, we risk provoking the Chinese Communist Party and that they will then view it existentially and respond accordingly. I would submit they already viewed this competition in existential terms. She said that our struggle and contest with Western countries is irreconcilable, so it will inevitably be long, complicated, and sometimes even very sharp. I think his goal goes well beyond regional hegemony and extends to global hegemony. She told Putin in one of their latest meetings that they have an opportunity unseen in a century to remake the entire global order in their image. So to put it more provocatively, I would submit that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping wants to destroy the American-led free world and replace it with something that's far more friendly to authoritarian regimes. And for those who don't think that the Chinese Communist Party is interested in exporting their techno-totalitarian model of governance, I think that would be a profoundly myopic view. Just look at what happened in Hong Kong recently with the complete evisceration of one country, two systems. I think that should tell us that if the Chinese Communist Party were successful in taking Taiwan by force if necessary, well, one, there would be no one country, two systems model. And two, Las Vegas rules would not apply. What happens there would not stay there. Taiwan would merely be a springboard to regional and then global dominance. Now, Xi Jinping won't come right out and say, we want to destroy America, though he comes pretty close if you actually read what he says to the party. He talks more broadly about the inevitable demise of the capitalist-led system. But I think they're aiming for something like a physician-assisted suicide, doing everything possible to allow us to get us to start to believe this narrative of inexorable decline, as well as enabling things like the fentanyl crisis in the United States, taking advantage of their access to social media platforms to pit Americans against Americans, taking advantage of the greed on Wall Street and corporate America to undermine our economic strength, and of course, courting a war in the Indo-Pacific with the really unprecedented tempo of pressure that they've placed against Taiwan.
How close is that relationship with Russia and to some extent also to a lesser extent maybe Iran? I mean, is it right to see it as a kind of axis, like the Axis powers in the 1930s and Second World War?
I think increasingly it looks a lot like an axis, an axis of authoritarians. I think people are competing right now to trademark this and name this axis. So you guys can host a sort of an ideas fest for what name we give it. Axis of evil is already taken and overused. Yeah. But, she referred to Putin as his best friend. They've met scores of times at this point. And I think there were a lot of people, myself included, by the way, who, when the No Limits partnership was announced, initially downplayed it, in part because from a historical perspective, these are very strange bedfellows, right? They almost came to blows in the old Cold War. They have outstanding territorial claims against each other, and their interests don't always align. But their overriding interest, which is taking down the United States-led West, and their overriding fear, which is this fear of their own people and fear of color revolutions. They're constantly talking about color revolutions, and the No Limits document talks about that. I think makes this something very much resembling an axis in which Xi Jinping is unquestionably the dominant power and Putin is his junior partner, or what my good friend in the UK, Tom Tugendhat, has called Xi's tethered goat in Europe, Vladimir Putin.
I want to talk mainly about China, but this question obviously comes up a lot, which is the war in Ukraine. And there are differing views on that in terms of how we should see that in the context of the strategic challenge with China. Some people argue very strongly, people like Bridge Colby, it's kind of a distraction. Whatever we may think of the rights of Ukraine, we're not against Ukraine defending itself, and it's, we're horrified by the invasion, all of that. But in the end, it's not our primary strategic objective, and by diverting resources, attention, diplomatic effort, and everything else away from China, we are weakening our ability to challenge China. Others say actually on the contrary, because just as you've laid out, these two powers are very strongly closely allied. Every piece of damage we can inflict on Russia is inflicting damage by proxy on China. Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, I think what Bridge and I would agree upon, and full disclosure, we are friends, is that the Indo-Pacific theater is the priority theater and therefore must be the main theater, and the Taiwan contingency must be the main contingency that we plan around, because China is what the Biden administration calls politely a pacing challenge. It's our foremost adversary on the world stage. Now, where we might disagree is that I believe deterrence in the Indo-Pacific theater, more specifically cross-strait deterrence, is at least correlated with the outcome on the battlefield in eastern Ukraine. And were our position to collapse, or were we to pull out our support of the Ukrainians and allow Russia to run roughshod over Ukraine, I think it would damage our position in the Indo-Pacific. To support that, I would suggest that the two biggest or most important countries in the Indo-Pacific certainly think that the outcome on the battlefield in Ukraine matters, one of them being China and the other being Japan. Furthermore, it should be possible for us to provide targeted, clinical, lethal assistance to the Ukrainians while simultaneously putting in place a deterrence by denial posture in the Indo-Pacific. What the collapse of deterrence in Ukraine has revealed is that our stockpiles of critical munitions are woefully insufficient, and therefore we have an opportunity to move to maximum production rates of critical munitions and long-range precision fires that are relevant in both the Indo-Pacific theater and the Ukrainian theater. The one thing that I think would render our ability to fulfill our treaty commitments and operationalize our war plans in the Indo-Pacific impossible would be if Putin were to simultaneously threaten the NATO alliance in the EUCOM theater. And so for that reason, among many others, I do think we need to support Ukraine. It doesn't mean Ukraine gets a blank check, and it doesn't mean that that is the only thing we should do, because China is the pacing threat and the Indo-Pacific theater is the priority theater.
So let's look at the pacing threat. And in the piece you wrote recently, and I know in other contexts, you praised some of the things the Biden administration has done. And the Biden administration would say in its defense, look, we've tightened even further. Perhaps it's the technology transfer that we've seen, the challenges that that's had. They have limited the ability of Chinese firms to get access to critical technology, or indeed to U.S. firms in general. They've strengthened the network of alliances that the U.S. has. AUKUS, the AUKUS deal, obviously, with Australia and the U.K. over submarines in the region, helping to improve relations between Japan and Korea, very important in terms of containing China. So they'd say they've done all of these things. And yet, again, you're still critical. What have they failed to do?
Well, all of those things could be true. And yet, the balance of conventional power in the Indo-Pacific continues to get worse. That is by far the most important variable. It sort of reminds me of when in high school you would submit a paper, and to make up for your lack of an argument, you would put it in a shiny, clear binder and, maybe have a fancy title. But if the argument itself isn't sound, then it doesn't matter how you dress it up. If we don't have a serious effort to rebuild conventional deterrence in the Indo-Pacific, no amount of export controls and no amount of diplomatic meetings can make up for that hole in our deterrence strategy. So that's the most important thing. I give the administration a lot of credit for AUKUS. I chaired the Friends of Australia caucus for 8 years in Congress. However, there we still have a lot of work to do. On Pillar 1, which is the nuclear submarine agreement, we need to figure out how to improve our own submarine industrial base. And every time we get a defense budget from the Biden administration that amounts to a real term cut to defense, it doesn't help that strategy. For the Pillar 2 portion of AUKUS, there are still barriers we need to break down to sharing cutting-edge technology with our two closest allies, the Brits and the Aussies. And then finally, I just would say the Biden administration, its approach to China shifted about 2 years into the administration away from this more hard-edged approach and towards a more accommodationist approach. That's when they started launching all these diplomatic initiatives, sending every major cabinet official, attempting to downplay the balloon incident. And on the non-military side, when it comes to things that truly matter, there's been no accountability for the CCP's cover-up of COVID, which sends a clear signal that they can get away with something that's killed tens of millions around the world. There's no evidence to suggest that the outcome of the APEC summit, this dialogue on counter-narcotics cooperation, has produced anything. In fact, my committee, in an investigation we completed before I left, definitively proved that the regime in China is incentivizing explicitly the export of deadly fentanyl precursor chemicals that are killing tens of thousands of Americans every single year. So I think the proof is in the pudding. And until we start to see a shift in the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific, and until we start to see a reduction in the aggression by the Chinese Communist Party, it doesn't matter how many meetings we have at APEC or at any other summit.
You mentioned there a couple of issues to do with Chinese infiltration, if you like, and undermining of the U.S. economy and of U.S. social cohesion. I mean, surveillance, like the surveillance balloon famously that we saw a year ago. You talk about the drugs, the fentanyl, and their role in that. You've seen a lot of very sensitive intelligence, which you're not going to share with us right now, I'm sure. But how serious is that direct threat? Another example, which again you've talked about, is TikTok and the way in which China manipulates that to manipulate domestic opinion. We've seen some other these stories of these Confucius Institutes and American universities. How serious, concerted an effort is China undertaking here to literally undermine the kind of foundations of American democracy?
Well, I came into this debate, as a recovering Middle East specialist and Marine who perhaps focused too much only on the military aspect of this competition. In the last few years, particularly during the pandemic, I gained an appreciation for the ideological dimensions of the competition. And everyone developed their sort of pandemic hobby. Mine was following all the CCP Wolf Warrior diplomats on Twitter and on other social media platforms that were really spending all day just bashing America, co-opting narratives that you see on the far left and on the far right in America, basically saying America is an evil, racist hellscape that should constantly apologize for its past sins and be afraid of its own shadow. So I have come to believe that this is fundamentally an ideological competition between two incompatible forms of government. And the CCP has launched a preemptive ideological strike designed to weaken our will to fight. And the more our own educational system fails to prepare the next generation of American citizens to believe that ours is a cause worth fighting for, that we, in this new Cold War, that we are indeed the good guys, the harder it is for us to prevail over the long term. That's why I do think the TikTok issue is a critical one. And I was proud to get my bill passed before I left Congress. I was proud that it was an extremely bipartisan effort. It would be an act of national self-sabotage, to paraphrase one of my Democratic colleagues, Richie Torres, who's phenomenal on this issue, if we allowed our primary foreign adversary to control the dominant news platform for young Americans. It would be as if during the height of the old Cold War, we allowed the Soviet Union and Pravda to buy ABC, NBC, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times, and that probably understates the scale of the threat. I guess all that's to say that if you believe my hypothesis, which is that to avoid hot war, you must wage Cold War, that must be done in the military dimension, in the ideological dimension, and in the economic and technological dimension. You need a fulsome strategy in order to be successful.
And I suppose, just as we were in the first Cold War with the Soviet Union, we are victims of the asymmetry here, aren't we, in terms of the way our systems work. And I hope we are doing all kinds of things to undermine China in China, whether it's, with the Uyghurs or whatever else we may be doing. But of course, in an authoritarian regime like that, it's much, much harder for us to do that, to weaken China from within. Whereas because of our open society, again, just as it was with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, but even more so now with our really open, thanks to technology and the internet and the ease of transfer of communications, it's incredibly easy for them, isn't it? Much easier for them to do real harm to us than we can do to them.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when former President Clinton was making the case for China's accession to the WTO and integration into the global economy. He said something to the effect of, good luck trying to keep the internet out of China. That will be like nailing Jell-O to a wall.
Nailing Jell-O to the Great Firewall.
I do think that poking holes in the Great Firewall or developing the technical capability to tear down the Great Firewall should take on the same level of urgency as taking the Berlin Wall did in the old Cold War, and would increase the strain under which the Chinese Communist Party operates. This actually gets to a key point and a key argument that Pottinger and I have made in our piece, which is that we do believe, just as Cold War strategists like George Kennan on down believed, any chance for successful containment would necessarily entail increasing the internal strain under which the Soviet Union operated. Similarly, today, we need to be taking steps to make life much harder for the Chinese Communist Party in order to deter them. As for your overall question On balance, this should be an advantage for us, right? I do think the basic logic of, in a free society such as ours, we are able to activate thousands of flexible, free-thinking minds in order to solve problems, a bottom-up approach as opposed to a top-down approach. That should be one of our greatest strengths, provided we allow for a bottom-up risk-taking approach. There's an excellent book by Aaron Freeberg called In the Shadow of the Garrison State, in which he argues that the sort of natural anti-statist bias inherent in America ended up being a massive strategic advantage for us when we competed with the Soviet Union, who had a much more top-down model. I think that same thing is true today, but in 2024, we find ourselves operating in a web of onerous regulations and amidst an administrative state that's just grown far too powerful. And where this really matters for our competition with China is as we attempt to onshore and nearshore, we can't out China by doing massive industrial policy in every single area. Better for us to adopt a crash deregulatory policy in order to unlock the power of American energy and innovation, allow us to mine and process rare earths and things like that. That's how we can get back to that model of allowing a free society to harness its natural strengths and then allowing a totalitarian strategy to stumble over its top-down approach and its inability to deal with friction and its inability to improvise.
A simple question on Taiwan, which is obviously where everybody's attention is focused as the main flashpoint or potential flashpoint for any immediate conflict. Are we doing enough right now to deter? I mean, we've maintained this posture of strategic ambiguity, so China's not supposed to know exactly what we would do and whether we would come to exactly whether we would get in a shooting war with China to defend Taiwan's territorial independence. But are we doing enough, do you think, to deter China? And if not, what more should we be doing over Taiwan?
No, we are not. There's still an unacceptable backlog of foreign military sales items, things that Taiwan has purchased. We're not giving these weapons to them. They're a wealthy country, but we haven't delivered because our system is so outdated. There are things like Harpoon missiles, which are critical to the defense of Taiwan, that were approved in 2015 and still haven't been delivered and won't be delivered till 2027. At the same time, we're putting our old Harpoon systems into deep storage. We could MacGyver them into an acceptable variant for the Taiwanese and deliver them to the island, and that would massively impact deterrence. The Pentagon has failed to spend $10 billion on average every year for the last 10 years, lighting some $125 billion on fire. That money goes back to the Treasury. I tried to pass a bill to give the Pentagon the authority to repurpose that to provide multi-year appropriations for long-range precision fires that are relevant for Taiwan. DoD is really bad at buying and investing in software. And so at the same time, we're trying to develop joint all-domain command and control. We are woefully behind on that. And DoD needs to be brought kicking and screaming into the era of software-defined warfare and algorithmic warfare. That's something that's going to be relevant for Taiwan. I guess I also worry about, and this is less in the near term for Taiwan and more long-term for the preservation and survival of the all-volunteer military. We have a recruiting crisis right now. Almost every service beside the Marine Corps has failed to meet their quotas. That tells me something is amiss in American society. And if you examine the polling, the numbers on propensity to serve suggest there's a very troubling generational shift. And if we continue down this path, we are going to be struggling to maintain the all-volunteer force, which is a remarkable achievement of our post-Vietnam security establishment and a remarkable Wisconsin achievement because Melvin Laird, a Secretary of Defense from Wisconsin, was present at its creation. And so that's an area where I think we need an all-hands-on-deck effort led by the president and continuing with his cabinet-level national security officials that we just haven't had. We need to recruit the next generation of warriors, cold warriors and actual warriors in order to defend this country and help our friends like Taiwan.
We're going to take a short break there, but when we come back, I'll have war with former Congressman Mike Gallagher. We're talking about the threat from communist China. We're also going to talk a bit about Republican politics and, of course, in this election year, what may be happening in the weeks and months ahead.
You're listening to Free Expression with Jerry Baker. Don't forget, you can listen to the latest episode anytime on your smart speaker. Just say, play the Opinion Free Expression podcast. Now, back to Jerry Baker.
I'm back with Mike Gallagher, former congressman who just stepped down from Congress a couple of months ago. We're talking primarily about the threat that China poses. One question on our economic relationship with China. One of the things that's obviously so different about this Cold War from the Cold War with the Soviet Union is the degree of economic integration between our two countries, and some would argue the degree of economic interdependence. And I wanted to ask you particularly about, I talk to a lot of business leaders, and I think many of them are now getting the message, but there is still a reluctance to do that decoupling that people talk about. Many of our companies, financial sector, but also tech, have tremendous markets in China, or indeed they have a significant supply chain there. I worry that if we really are in, as I'm sure you're right, in this Cold War, and we need to be much more aggressive about winning this Cold War, there is this economic kind of weight on us, and it's particularly, as I say, kind of perpetuated by some of these business leaders. Do you think that we've done enough to really get the message home, and how much more of a challenge is that going to be, do you think?
Well, I think this is what makes the new Cold War far more difficult and complex than the old, right? The original long telegram that Kennan wrote said, the problem of how to cope with the Soviet Union was undoubtedly the greatest task our diplomacy has ever faced, and probably it will ever face. Well, he was wrong, because I think we have an even greater task in the present day, precisely because economically, technologically, after over 2 decades of trying to integrate China into the global economy in the hopes it would moderate their political behavior, we are now conjoined twins economically with our greatest geopolitical foe. I'm certain we've never encountered that situation before. I'm not sure any country in history has ever encountered a situation like that in history before. But that doesn't mean we throw up our hands and say, well, we can't compete. And it also doesn't mean that a proposed Cold War footing and strategy is moot. In fact, what Pottinger and I argue is that the Soviet and Chinese systems are more alike, at least in the sense that today China has the world's second largest GDP at about 65% of the US GDP. Well, so did the Soviet Union for most of the Cold War. In the 1970s, by the CIA's estimate, the Soviet economy reached 57% of US GNP. Now, again, it's not perfectly analogous, but the size of the challenge, if not the interconnectedness, was at least similar. We believe that in order to deal with that, we need to start the process of weaning ourselves off our dependency on China in critical areas. Now, reasonable people can disagree about what those areas are, and I am not calling for a complete decoupling of our economy from China's, but it is an empirical observation that Xi Jinping is attempting to decouple from us. And so if we don't get in the game and figure out how we don't have to rely on China for the processing of critical minerals, figure out how they can't weaponize the production and export of active pharmaceutical ingredients, as Chinese Communist Party officials threatened to do in the early stages of the pandemic, and thereby plunge us into a sea of coronavirus, was the phrase they used. If we don't have a more sensible energy policy that allows us to exploit one of our asymmetric advantages against a country like China that has massive energy needs and doesn't have the resources we do, then I think it's only going to get more difficult to deter the Chinese Communist Party in the future. Put differently, if you sort of got a bad diagnosis from your doctor that you have heart disease, you would probably start exercising aggressively today, as opposed to just, maintaining your sedentary habits and waiting for the heart attack to come. Similarly, I think we need to start the hard business of reducing the coercive economic leverage that the Chinese Communist Party has. It's not easy. It's going to be very difficult, but it's an essential task if we want to have a chance of preventing this Cold War from becoming hot.
We talked about a lot of things that we need to do. And one of the things, obviously, we have to increase our overall defense spending. We're 3% of GDP. In the first Cold War, even in relatively peaceable times, it was 4, 5, 6% of GDP. And of course, at the peak of the Cold War is much higher than that. Yet most people confronting this challenge would agree with that. And yet, of course, we do have significant fiscal constraints. We're already way, way deeper in debt than we would at any point in the first Cold War, with no obvious plans really to reduce that. How are we going to do it? How are we going to allocate the necessary resources to more defense spending while we have such a really fragile fiscal outlook?
Here, I guess I'm now an outlier among Democrats and Republicans, because not even Republicans want to talk about entitlement reform. But it strikes me, if you're concerned about the debt and the limits that our debt crisis imposes on our ability to provide for the common defense, then we should start by attacking the drivers of our debt, which of course is mandatory spending, our entitlement programs, even modest reforms to Social Security and healthcare. And I count myself as one of the few millennials recently in Congress. My generation is highly skeptical that these programs are going to exist by the time we are at or near retirement. And so for the leaders of both political parties to say, well, we can't touch entitlement spending, I just think it's profoundly irresponsible, because the status quo actually means these programs get cut. So I actually do think we need to figure out how to responsibly reform those programs and thereby free up budget space. And I refuse to accept as adamantine the Procrustean bed that progressives have made for us, one which holds hard power hostage to the domestic welfare state. For example, Biden initiated a $4.6 trillion new spending plan, and that included $1.85 trillion for the American Rescue Plan and a pandemic relief bill that focused on domestic progressive priorities. There was $370 billion on infrastructure that was really climate change. Imagine if we had just used a fraction of that for a military buildup, how much better of an investment that would have made. And yet we still are locked in this paradigm where any increase in defense has to be matched by an increase in domestic progressive spending. I fundamentally reject that. Internal to the military, there are savings to be had. I've argued for dramatically reducing the size of the biggest branch of the military, which is DoD civilians, at over 800,000 strong. In some ways, the military is a microcosm of the crisis the rest of society is facing, which is to say retirement and healthcare costs are overwhelming everything. And we're at risk of becoming a medical and retiree club with some guns thrown into the mix. So I do concede the point that there are savings to be had within the defense budget, but the lack of consistent defense budgeting and the lack of a coherent plan and the lack of a steady state increase ultimately ends up wasting money over time.
We've segued quite neatly there for our final few minutes into some of the hot domestic political topics. But first of all, you stepped down from Congress just earlier this year. A bit of a shock for a lot of people. You won't mind me saying, it won't make your head swell too much to say that you're very much a rising star in the Republican Party, and a lot of hopes were invested in you. What's behind the decision to step away from politics?
Well, you kind of say that, although I was joking with my wife the other day that for 8 years, periodically someone would write an article saying Gallagher's a rising star. If you're still rising after 8 years, you must have fallen without anybody really actually knowing it. So the decision was purely based on what's best for my family. I got married midway through my time in Congress. We are blessed to have 2 young daughters that are 3 years old and 1 year old. And it's just such a tough lifestyle for a young family, given that we want to grow that family. And, while I signed up for the death threats and the constant chaos and the late night swatting, my wife and my baby daughters did not. So it was purely a decision based on what's best for my family. I guess the selfish aspect of it is that I did always have in mind, going out on a high legislative note. And so being able to leave after the committee passed the TikTok bill and after we had accomplished all the things I wrote out that I wanted to accomplish at the beginning of the year, was for me attractive. The final thing I'd say is public service will always be my passion. I intend to devote the rest of my life to it in one form or another. But in some ways, I see myself as returning to my roots as a pure national security professional, as opposed to a political figure. That was the type of career I'd wanted to build early on when I got out of the Marine Corps. And politics was really an unexpected detour. Now, it was a wonderful adventure. It was an honor of a lifetime, but it was never something that I intended to make a career. And part of the reason I feel so fervently about term limits is I do think members tend to overstay their welcome. And you wake up one day and you've been in politics for 20, 30 years, you kind of lose touch with reality and it doesn't keep you sharp. So I really wanted to avoid that.
Your comment about being a rising star for so long reminds me of a comment of a British it was once said of a British politician that he'd gone from being a rising star to an elder statesman without any intervening period whatsoever. And you don't want to find yourself in that position. But so let me just ask you there, because there's a little bit of a hint there. So if we get a Republican administration next year, and if you were asked, would you be willing to serve in an executive position, in a position in the administration in some national security field?
Well, my view has always been, if the president asks, and by the way, that applies for the president of either party, Trump or Biden, you have to say yes, provided the role is right. It would be incredibly destructive to my personal life and our foremost mission, which is to build a family and lead that family into heaven. But my professional mission is to prevent World War III. So if the president asked me to do something where I could look myself in the mirror and sort of say I was doing that, I'd probably have to say yes. I doubt that's going to happen, though. But that's my old school view.
And finally, I do want to ask you about the state of politics, Republican politics. I'm certainly not going to ask you to handicap the election, either the election in Wisconsin, although I would be interested to know your thoughts there. Obviously, a key swing state for both presidency and the Senate, I guess. But more generally, about how do you see the Republican Party as it is now? It's clearly seems to be relatively well united behind Donald Trump. He's going to be the candidate in November. Is it now Donald Trump's party? And if so, what is that? Is it a populist party? Does it reject those traditional conservative positions like, things we've talked about, like, restraining fiscal spending, entitlement reform, like free trade? Is it now a populist party rather than a kind of a traditional conservative party, do you think?
Well, first, I see it kind of in Dickensian terms. It is the best of times and the worst of times. On the one hand, I think we're on the right side of a lot of issues. Educational reform, I think the pandemic was an eye-opening experience for a lot of parents, even those that are independent or center left, and that should provide an opportunity for Republicans who have long been talking about things like school choice. Culturally, I think the woke nonsense we're seeing from the left just provides an opportunity for Republicans to be normal and not crazy and aligned with all the beer drinking, deer hunting, normal people of Northeast Wisconsin. And I think the core strength on national security of a hardline policy, standing up to America's adversaries, supporting a robust military deterrent is still an advantage, particularly in light of the massive deterrence failures we're seeing come from the Biden administration's feckless foreign policy. On the other hand, Donald Trump is unquestionably the most dominant figure in the Republican Party and will remain so for quite some time, I think. And that's fine, right? He won an election. Where I get off the train is when we have like this reflexive allegiance to the presidency and the executive branch, because my view is that the presidency and the executive branch have gotten too powerful. And there, I think Republicans have strayed away from traditional conservatism. And I think we would do well to recover our respect for competitive federalism and, our desire to inject some fiscal sanity into the federal government before it's too late. That being said, whether it's Donald Trump's party, I don't know, whether it's a populist party, it's a big tent party and has always been thus, or always should be thus. We should be seeking to bring more people into it. It will evolve over time, depending on what happens in this election. And there should be room for China hawks who want to reform entitlements like me, and also more people that have a different approach. You don't need to agree on 100% of things.
And finally, just very briefly, is it going to be a double Republican win in Wisconsin at the presidency and Senate in November?
Well, Wisconsin's always hard. Republicans tend not to win the presidency in Wisconsin. Donald Trump was the first to do it in 2016 since Reagan, I think, in 1984. And that had a lot to do with Hillary Clinton infamously never showing up because the Pulse nightclub shooting had her cancel her first campaign appearance with Obama, which was going to be in my hometown of Green Bay. The other thing that worries me is that the Democratic Party of Wisconsin has woken up. Their infrastructure, their fundraising is very aggressive. So I think we have a shot, but it's going to require a lot of work. It's going to require a lot of discipline from Donald Trump. Wisconsin is never a state that can be taken for granted. And there's, a lot of split ticket voters in Wisconsin. I won my district by about 20,000 more votes than Trump did in 2020. And he lost the state by 20,000 votes. And that tells you that there are independents that will split their tickets. And so those people need to be won in order for Wisconsin to be won.
Well, we'll be there. It'll be the center of the universe next month when we'll all be there in Milwaukee for the Republican convention. So we'll look forward to seeing how it's going on the ground. Former Congressman Mike Gallagher, thanks very much for joining Free Expression.
Yeah, it was an honor. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Free Expression. Thanks very much for joining us. I'll be back next week with another episode. In the meantime, have a great week and goodbye.